week 24, and we are on to day 6. Here we see two different stories. We see a lot of parallel stories from here on out through the divided kingdom, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. And so we see that both Rehoboam, who is the king of Judah, and Jeroboam, who is the king of Israel, both of them fail to follow God. And as a result, they see their reigns end early. God speaks to Jeroboam, whom he chose to lead the kingdom of Israel. Jeroboam had been a counselor to Solomon himself. He had lost favor with Solomon, and God had promised him that if he remained faithful, that he would be brought into power. And so Jeroboam eventually would become king of Israel there in the north. However, out of fear, out of concern that the people would turn away from him and his authority, he did things that brought people's eyesight, brought their eyes, brought their attention, brought their affinity to God away from God. And as a result, God even speaks out to him in 1 Kings 14, verse 9, "You have flung me behind your back." The one thing God asked of him was faithfulness. And instead, in these words from God, "You flung me behind your back." Chronicles, the book of Chronicles, actually focuses on the kings of Judah. And so here we see what's going on with Rehoboam. Rehoboam is, he starts off pretty awful. In fact, one of the reasons, and particularly the big reason why the kingdoms split and we now have Israel and Judah, is that he failed to listen to the older, wiser counselors. And he wanted instead to have glory brought upon himself. And he was going to be even greater than his father Solomon. And that ego caused a rift that caused for the division of the kingdoms. So he started off poorly, and he didn't do so well most of the time. But here is an important point. God softened his judgment against Rehoboam when Rehoboam repented. Repentance. When we turn our hearts away from the wrongdoing, when we promise, when we come back to God, declaring that indeed God is the one that we need to be following. If we remember going back to Rehoboam's grandfather, David is still to this day called a man after God's own heart. Even after everything that he did, his adultery, or what we probably mean more realistically, his rape of Bathsheba, his efforts to have her husband Uriah killed when she became pregnant, even in all of those, we still call David a man after God's own heart. Why? Because David repented. David realized that he was wrong. Being a person after God's own heart doesn't mean that we are perfect. Doesn't mean that we in ourselves have never done anything wrong. But it recognizes that God is God and we are not. It recognizes that when we do wrong, we need to acknowledge that we have done wrong and ask God to forgive us, knowing that in God's great love, God will forgive us. Are we going to be people after God's own heart, having a whole heart for God? Or are we going to be those who choose to go our own ways and then grumble and complain when God doesn't bless us the way we think God should? Which should we choose today?